Hey there, I'm Gilad Barash, and welcome to Who's Your Data, the podcast that deals with how data influences life and how life influences data, the human side of data analytics. Hey everyone, welcome to the 30th episode of the Who's Your Data podcast. I am so excited to host the one, the only Dr. Claudia Perlich, data scientist extraordinaire, mentor, and friend who dives deep into the evolving landscape of AI and data science, navigating the hype around AI's capabilities, and addressing ethical concerns like bias in algorithms. Claudia brings her no-nonsense, real-world insights and tackles everything from the unpredictability of human behavior to the challenges of maintaining privacy in a data-driven world. Thought-provoking and candid, this conversation explores whether AI is set to replace data scientists or if human judgment will always reign supreme. Let's get to the conversation. So, Claudia, welcome to the Who's Your Data podcast. This is an extreme honor.
Yeah, I'm so excited we finally made this happen. We have been talking about this for such a while, and it's tough with your traveling and so on to get us both at least in the same city. At least we manage this time around. So I can't wait.
All right, so let's dive right into it. My first question to you is, are we all going to die? Is AI sentience coming soon? And are humans screwed? What do you think?
No, I'm a optimist on that. I've been both amazed by how far we have come. I initially kind of jumped into AI back in '96, previous to the most recent AI winter, and we have come such a long way. And of course, there are scary parts to it, but it's also made a real jump forward in terms of its capabilities of things that I personally don't really like to do, like writing stuff or translating. So there are some true value propositions here. I think we still need to figure it out how much of an impact it ultimately will have. I'm not particularly worried about singularities and things of that sort. So at this moment, I'm really excited to watch the progression. I think some of the hype is overblown, and we're kind of getting into the area of realizing where the limitations of its usefulness is. But yeah, I still sleep very well at night.
Okay. Now, it's no secret. We've known each other for over 10 years. In fact, you hired me for my first real data science job. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what you do, how you got into, machine learning and AI and
So my path, I think, originated. So I grew up in East Germany, and my mom wanted me to be a doctor. I was not interested, but I did love animals and biology. And initially, I wanted to study biology. Then I realized the job descriptions in that field really didn't look that promising. And my dad says, "You know what? You are very logical. You're good at math. Just study computer science, and you will have a lot of opportunities later on." And he was really very far-sighted about this. So background then in computer science, but found it a little bit boring writing compilers and all of that stuff. And so when I was an exchange student in Boulder, Colorado, there was a course offered in '95 on artificial intelligence and another one on artificial neural networks. And I was kind of great, finally a chance to learn something about how brains work in the context of computer science. Little that I knew that this is really where we have now landed with deep learning and these incredible structures that mimic the human brain in some ways, at least philosophically. So I found my way to my first data science course at a time where it was really the stepchild of computer science because we couldn't really do much with it yet. But I totally fell in love with data. And it was really the curiosity about learning new things about domains I had no idea about. And the beauty was being an introvert, I didn't even have to talk to people about it. You could just look at data and learn things. So that's the kind of short origin story. I later got my PhD from Stern in the business school, where I started to focus a lot more on the applications of machine learning over the algorithms themselves. And then found my way to IBM Research, where I worked for 6 years at the Watson Lab. And then I got an offer I felt I couldn't refuse, where I was asked to join a startup in the advertising technology space in New York City. And what was fascinating about this, the company actually had spoken to my PhD advisor and taken some of my PhD work, which otherwise would have completely gotten forgotten, as part of their targeting algorithm. And so I jumped at the opportunity of joining Distillery, originally called Media 6 Degrees, and really focused about 8 years building machine learning models to predict what people might do in the service of finding the right consumers for the various brands that we were engaging with. And there were a lot of kind of side stories around fraud and causality that I truly enjoyed working on. And I also started doing a lot more public speaking about those topics. And then eventually decided that I had learned as much as I wanted to learn about marketing. I was ready for another challenge. And finally, I joined Two Sigma, which is in the financial space, working now much more on understanding financial instruments and how they're being traded, and trying to build algorithms that automate a lot of the decision making there.
That definitely sounds like quite a journey. And really, I think that it's quite a privilege to be able to take your PhD thesis and then turn it into industry and actually see it do things. So that's really cool. We have had many conversations over the years, and I want to just philosophical about where things are going in the AI space and the data space and the data science space. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity to sort of ask you these questions again and get an updated answer and see where we are in 2024 with generative AI. So one thing we once had a conversation where you described today as sort of the end of the golden age of data science. So can you talk about that a little bit from your perspective? How has the data science landscape changed in recent years, especially in the last couple of years, as it pertains to, the revolution of generative AI? And, does it affect your work? And how do you think it bodes for the future? And do you think data scientists themselves have actually changed? And how do you think all of that will continue to change?
So let me first maybe clarify what my complaint at the time was. And reflecting on this has been a while. So let me roll back. If you think about data science as a really exciting new direction, that was around starting 2012, 2013, 14, where it rose as the hot topic. And what was fascinating then, we had already at IBM and other places talked about how data is everywhere and we should do more machine learning. We didn't call it data science at the time, but it remained a niche to only certain types of industries and topics. And what happened in this rise of data science is all of a sudden it spread everywhere. So it was no longer just machine learning for tech stuff, but you saw social scientists and political and environmental science get really into looking at data and exploring this. There was even a blog of a data science analysis of what's going on OkCupid. So all of a sudden, you have people from all walks of life getting interested and picking up the tools, mostly just some basic Python, to do really fascinating and interesting stuff. What I really liked about it was because those folks didn't come from computer science background, but they brought deep expertise and excitement and interest and enthusiasm about their respective areas and really did cool stuff. So we then moved a little bit forward, and a couple of years later, I got worried that it might have gotten too easy to build machine learning models, because I also know what can go wrong with them. And the moment becomes a push button where almost anybody who doesn't necessarily have a deep understanding of statistics can build something that has its own dangers to it. But when I had this conversation with you about the end of the golden age, what I observed then is the field on the tooling and technology side just became so vast and uncoordinated. On one hand side, you had great numbers of open source contributions from folks from different areas, but then you also had vendors. You started doing things in the cloud. You had to start thinking about how to manage libraries in Python, how to babysit Spark instances. So the playing field of the now stack became so complicated. It wasn't just about running a program on your laptop. And the error messages became increasingly harder to find, impossible to understand. And I felt like there was this running ahead of technology to trying to solve problems, but leaving the casual computer scientist who really came from a different domain a little bit lost in the weeds of how to put all of these things together. And now reflecting about this in 24, I'm wondering if AI is kind of bringing us back full circle by allowing folks who are not programmers by training to have those tools create software for them to execute some of these more interesting analysis without having to really appreciate the syntax of Python to the degree that you only get to if you do it every day.
Yeah, you make an excellent point. I think, nowadays with ChatGPT that can write code, that can help you orchestrate things, you really do have a new platform that helps you maybe simplify all of these complex moving parts, with the risk, however, that you can't trust it blindly. It might surprise you.
So I heard a really fun statement is that the true value of ChatGPT is to make all the professors code again. So I think there is indeed something for the casual coder who knows how to do it, but has gotten a little bit out of touch and has all of the experience of validating what's going on. I think on the industrial side, we certainly see more and more embracing of ChatGPT as a source of code. But there are these voices that say, well, yeah, maybe it's faster to write me the prototype, but then I spend much more time trying to understand and validating that the code is doing what I wanted. Then ultimately it might actually even out in terms of the efficiency that it brings to experienced professional coders who feel like, yes, you get a speed up, but then you spend so much more time on diligence.
I will say, though, that I remember from grad school when my grad advisor was asked what her favorite programming language was. She said grad students.
Yes, that just doesn't scale if you're not in grad school.
It's true, it does not scale. Shifting gears, one of the things that, I think that has been consistent in your career that you really look at, and the reason that I love talking to you is because you deal a lot with real world situations and real world data and how it really applies to the real world. There are a lot of academic exercises that you can do with data, and you can use toy data, and you can really talk a lot about models, but you really get your hands dirty with the real world and its ramifications, whether it is in digital advertising and whether it's in finance. Ultimately, it's about human behavior and how you can predict human behavior, whether you're interested in a certain brand or have a proclivity towards a certain type of activity or any kind of interest in, financial world. And so from your experience in different industries, how predictable really ultimately is human behavior?
That's such a great question to ponder. I mean, philosophically, it really means what you're asking me is, well, how much free will is there? And in my mind, free will is kind of fundamentally opposed to the notion of predictability. And I occasionally read these articles of voices saying that maybe we have a lot less of that free will than we wish to believe. However, I'm deeply committed to the belief that I have some choice about my fate. So to make it a little bit less abstract, I think there's a really wide range, right? If you think about, there are things about fundamentally part of my identity. And there have been studies showing that you can very easily predict sexual orientation or religious beliefs or a number of other things based on fairly limited observations of people's behavior. And that might be concerning in and by itself, but I think that's an instance of some very strong predictability. On the other hand, you have things like, well, am I going to have pizza tonight? I have no idea. I mean, good luck to any machine trying to predict that, right? So there is really wide range depending on which aspect of human behavior you're looking at when you're trying to get a sense of, well, how well could you possibly predict this. But I think the topic is really well timed today because I'm struggling with the expectations that society and individuals have on how predictive AI can be. There is this dichotomy of expectations that, oh, it's a machine learning model, AI, it has to be perfect. And I think a part that is being nourished by vendors telling you that AI is all you will ever need to predict something. But the reality is that every problem, the same way my behavior is predictable to a certain degree, I think to your point about the reality, every problem I tackle, there's a different level of the maximum predictability I can get to. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And over time, you develop an expectation of what this can be. So in financial markets where I'm now, it's just almost non-predictable. It's just as close to non-predictable as you can get. And it's much different from the typical human behavior. But I think the public understanding of how right models can be and what the upper limit is really important to help us more conscientiously engage with these tools and make the best use of them.
So I mean, I think you make a great point, and it makes me think, for example, right, models don't have to be perfect. They just, like a certain politician says, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And so,
Right.
for example, a medical model that predicts maybe, the risk for cancer or a lesion or something that looks at MRIs, doesn't have to be perfect. It needs to be better than the resident or the doctor that's looking at it. If it is able to make less mistakes, right, false positives or false negatives, it's already better. It really is a question of how we decide to judge.
Yeah, I think it's two pieces to it. There is the fundamental question, how do you use it? Is it good enough to make decisions by itself? Is it more of an assistant to a doctor as a second opinion? It doesn't have to be better. It just has to,
Right.
once in a while, raise its hand and say, hey, do you want to rethink this? Because there might be some evidence to it. But I think the flip side is also interesting. When you think about the end user, the doctor, or we have seen really much more, very worrisome examples in, let's say, predictive policing and facial recognition. Does the user appreciate, first off, does the user get information about the degree of certainty that these models have? Do they provide some kind of error bounds or estimates? And does the end user really take it into account? Right? So you have both of these problems where the tools often don't come with error margins. And I just told the story about the by now well-known example. When you ask an LLM how many R's there are in Raspberry, it will give with deep convictions consistently wrong answers. And it will never say, oh, I'm not sure, maybe I'm not understanding your question. But it always answers with a deep conviction. And I think that is highly problematic. And then the second question, if a, let's say, facial match comes with a, well, the probability of this is the best I found, but it's really not a very high confidence match, do we then say, okay, let's step very careful, or we say, oh, it's the thing that was spit out by the all-knowing AI, and let's run with it no matter what the human costs are? I think both of these things tie into kind of certainty and predictability and the quality of a model.
And understanding what that model means and what it's giving you back. It's not
Right.
a definite answer. It is tied
Yeah.
to some statistical probability.
The other really interesting aspect about predictability is how it can lead to one of the biggest issues we're having today with using machine learning models, and that is the observation that models are biased in some ways. How does it touch on predictability is really subtle and fascinating, because models have the tendency to find the most predictable piece of information. That's literally what we ask them to do. That's their raison d'etre. And what happens as a result is that it will always give the highest scores for those things it's most certain about. But if you have differences in the population, there are groups of people that you know less about. As a result, the scores for those groups of people will never be the highest, either in the positive or in the negative. Other things are just more predictable. And we worked on this even together when we all of a sudden saw our marketing models getting really, really good. All of a sudden, it was much easier to predict who would click on what ad and who would sign up for what service. And the moral of the story was our models had found a new source of predictability that were basically bots. So computer programs written to do something, of course, they're more predictable than people. And even if these bots are a very small percentage of what we're observing, it didn't take long for all of our campaigns wanting to only target bots because it was so easy to tell with certainty that they would do certain things that we were looking to achieve. And so this interaction effects where models will focus on what's easy. And if you give them a bunch of resumes, whichever resume has less information is less likely to rise to the top in terms of being suitable for a particular position. And that's a very kind of intrinsic way of models amplifying biases that may or may not have been in the data to start with.
And so that you bring up an excellent point that is something that I think about a lot around bias in the data and in the models, where it comes from and how we can address it. Is it bias in the data? Are you not sampling correctly? Are you clear on what you're sampling? You may be sampling something that you're not realizing you're either missing or too much of or something. That bias can either show up in the data, it can show up maybe in the data scientists themselves that are creating the models. And so I'd love to hear more about how you think about reducing bias in data and in AI in general. Some have even gone so far as to propose training data scientists on how to identify and prevent bias in their models. Do you agree with this approach, or how do you think about it in both the advertising and financial sectors?
So I think bias is such an interesting topic, and I will maybe start again a little bit philosophically here. Part of the issue is that we don't have a terribly clear definition of what we are really talking about. And every time I'm trying to transition from, oh yeah, I mean, I know it when I see it, this is wrong, to what's the technical definition of it, then the boundary between what is personalization versus what is bias is really hard to narrow down, because the whole reason we are using these very sophisticated algorithms is to be more personalized rather than saying, oh, it's a human being, therefore X. We're looking for what's most interesting to this very specific human being. Is this person most suitable for this very specific position, right? It's all about making it more personal, but that in many ways is also meaning it's more biasing towards a particular set of characteristics. So to me, that there's a close relationship to that, but that means we need to kind of come back and say, let's actually agree on, because what I think we mean is something like fairness and justice. Mm-hmm. That we want models to be used for a good purpose, or at least not to do any harm. But that also puts the onus on us as society, and not just the techies who are implementing this, to clearly understand and maybe state, what does that mean to us? And I think as a society, we have shifted our position, and we're constantly evolving on what this kind of fairness and justice means. And what you're seeing right now is, when you look at bias, I think I read one seminal paper that had about 26 different measures of what bias might be. And the reality is you can usually get one of them or two of them right, but there won't be ever a good model that naturally is unbiased according to all of these different metrics that you could consider. Which really brings home the point, this is not just a technical issue. Yes, we should absolutely, as data scientists, be very conscientious about what went wrong in the data collection, or how is it misreflecting societal standards that we have today, but that are still part of the data. We certainly have the onus of testing our models for the types of biases we know we want to avoid. But I really believe that we need to involve the decisions maker and make the kind of the business side or the use case much more, hold them responsible to, well, you tell me what you want. If you as a business want to ensure that you are hiring minorities or as many female as male candidates, yes, I can try to make your model that will suggest at equal rates, but how about you also, other than just saying it, make sure from the lists that the algorithms are proposed, you invite as many of the groups as you consider a balanced or a fair trade-off. Because trying to debias the model, the unfortunate truth is most of the time it means you make it dumber in some area. If you want the model to have equal error rates across all subpopulations, and sometimes the model is more predictable on one of them versus the other, you can't increase it. The only thing you can do is dumb it down. But if you think about medical applications, that for some populations, you can diagnose cancer better than others. So what do we do here? Do we debias it and make it equally bad? Or is this a trade-off now that on the moral side, needs really a societal response rather than data scientists digging around the training data, figuring out how to change the sampling to get some desired behavior. So I really see it's a call to action to us work together on an agreement of what we want and then explore all of the avenues and the different dials we have, technical and otherwise, to influence decisions in a way that they are fair and just.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it goes back to exactly what we expect of the models, and how much of the heavy lifting we expect them to do, even on the philosophical, moral side of it. And I've seen, especially with around diversity and hiring, that stakeholders, don't necessarily do the hard work themselves exactly in terms of that. They just wait for resumes to come up through LinkedIn and then, go from there, where you should really be looking and finding resumes that are more diverse lived experiences in different channels, because they may not appear all in LinkedIn or one of these main platforms. And to just let the technology take care of it rather than have more intent in being inclusive in your own work is lazy.
Well, when was the last time that delegating a moral issue to a technical solution worked well for humanity?
That is an excellent question. Definitely not ever since Skynet became self-aware. So the other thing that that we talk a lot about on the Who's Your Data podcast is the issue of privacy. And privacy has been a hot topic for a while now. We've certainly come across it in working in advertising, and certainly with the expansion of AI-driven applications. Now, hot scoop here, you personally don't actually have any social media outside of LinkedIn, which is an amazing way to keep your data private. Do you think we can maintain privacy in a world where AI requires large amounts of data to perform well? It really is it's a privacy versus convenience equation of how much data we're willing to give away in order to have a convenient life. How do you think about that?
I want to tackle that question from a couple of different directions. So first off, I want to clarify that my lack of social media visibility is not at all related to privacy concerns. It's just that I'm not very social. Well, I'm more of the classical introvert who likes to have very limited kind of social interactions. It's just not very appealing to me. I think so. I can less take the kind of deep stand of being concerned about privacy. And on a personal level, for me, maybe this is having grown up in East Germany, where you're assumed to be constantly under surveillance anyway. I'm not personally very concerned about privacy, but I do recognize that it's the right of every person to decide what the level of privacy is that they would like. And I also see how the kind of expectations on privacy are changing over time. My mom had a completely different perspective of what laundry she might hang in the backyard because of privacy concerns. And I don't really care people seeing my laundry in the backyard. But back to, I think, the much more relevant application of how it interacts with the data hunger of modern AI and advertising and so on. I think largely I've come to the point where I feel we're really doing society a disservice. Yes, with more data, I can build better targeting models, but ultimately, I don't think that all that hyper targeting has really benefited anybody in the sense that even if the ads become somewhat more personalized, I'm not necessarily interested in trying to convince people to buy stuff that they may not need. And I think it really just fuels more of the attention economy in a way that is unlikely good for the end user and even unlikely good for brands to go hyper targeted on so many of their products. At least that's kind of when I walked away from advertising. And having the recent developments, whether this is conscious efforts to, for instance, build ID-free solutions, as our company has done, where you're really kind of leaving a little bit of that personalization behind and say, it's good enough if I get the right group of people, because you may not be able to measure its impact as directly as to get this spike in conversion rate. But I think even for the brands, it does better than optimizing some of these fakeable metrics that we're often after. And on the social, so my one guilty pleasures, I spend too much time watching YouTube. And again, the recommendation engine is using my data. And I wish it was worse, because I think I would do better things with my time if it was a little worse. Now, to completely switch it off and get random YouTubes, I'm not quite in that pond. But I do think we want to get to less personalization, because ultimately the value proposition for society, not even talking about the privacy violations, are really low as far as I'm concerned. But I don't think you can wait for industry self-organization as long as there's so much value attached to the attention paid by users and how much they're scrolling. I think there we really need a lot more governance and oversight to make us all collectively step back and level the playing field of what some companies know about us and should be collecting. So I don't have a silver bullet at all. And I have this more nuanced that on the one side, I don't care about it, but on the other, I don't think it's even worth the price we pay, because what we're getting for it, I don't think it's necessarily good for us.
That's one of the reasons I don't even have TikTok and refuse to get it, because I know the algorithm is so good. It just draws you in, and it's a time sink. Now, some argue that AI may eventually replace many roles currently performed by data scientists and analysts. Do you believe that the role of the data scientist itself could be automated, or will human judgment always be necessary?
I just actually published a blog about my collective thoughts and perspectives on this. And I'm very optimistic that there is a very important role, and will continue to be, for human judgment and input. And we just had this discussion yesterday when you came as a guest speaker to my MBA class, where your point was, yes, you need to code table stake. That's what AI is increasingly doing. But what we need more than that is even the engagement with the business stakeholders to figure out what problem to solve. It's not about, the skill isn't build the best mousetrap to predict something. I think that will become more and more a commodity. We see it already with commodity nature of LLMs. But to help the business understand, or whoever the stakeholder is, could be nonprofit, what do we even need this for? And so one of my favorite questions is, okay, if I built you this thing that can predict X, what would you do with it? And very often you come to the point where the stakeholder realizes, yeah, that was actually more of a nice to have, but I really have to spend a lot more time thinking deeply about how this would be useful. And I'm not seeing even remotely AI coming to the point of having this level of thoughtful conversation and understanding the context and the objectives and what's possible. So that's one side where there's this differentiating skill set that data scientists should have to connect what they're doing to what the objectives are and whether it might be meaningful. So that's kind of one side. I think the other one, and this is where we get more into the hardships of dealing with data, I yet have to see a automation that can detect issues with errors. You can detect certain types of biases, maybe, but data is broken in so many subtle ways that are often only becoming apparent when you are putting it into the context of how it was collected. And again, you need to ask those questions because the vendor is not telling you any of this,
Right.
but you just snoop around and you realize, wow, I have all of these ID fields in here. It's supposed to be a patient ID, but it comes in 4 separate buckets. Well, either it's a random number or it isn't, but it shouldn't really be 4 separate buckets. And it then turned out, yes, the data was sampled from 4 different medical locations, and the cancer prevalence rate was very different in these 4 different locations. And all that had happened is the model had learned what the grayscale calibration of the fMRI machine was in the location, rather than detecting what in the image was actually indicative of cancer. And I don't think that that degree of questioning, understanding of data is possible for an AI that doesn't have the human capacity of deeply understanding the context in which we're trying to use it and in which data was collected. So I think the role of quality control, it's exactly what very experienced software engineers say. Yes, they can write code, but it then still takes my skill to verifying that it is doing what it's meant to do. And I think that role will continue to be a human one to play, and where data scientists will be absolutely necessary.
You know, a lot of the mechanical stuff will get automated, but it's the kind of the bigger picture, the strategic, the quality control of asking the business questions and relating what, you know, the sampling of the data, how does that relate to the business question? Are you answering the right business question with it? Those are things that I agree that I think humans are still going to be playing a role until AI takes over completely. In which case,
So yeah, to all of you listening here, this is still absolutely a field worth going into, especially if you like to think about the world and how it works and understanding. You have that side of curiosity to you. I think that's the staple of a very successful future data scientist.
Yeah, it's curiosity about the world and about data, and it's and data intuition. Now, Claudia, you are a woman and you are a data scientist. And for the over 10 years that I've known you, I know that you've been giving talks about, you know, women in data science. And I don't want you to talk specifically about women in data science, but I am curious if in the 10 years that you've been talking about this subject, has your talk changed? Or do you feel like the message is still the same as it was 10 years ago?
I do want to give this question a moment of thought, because I think what is hard for me is whether I have changed or whether the world has changed.
Oh, that's an
Because
excellent point. But you, as a woman data scientist, has changed. That's, you know, that's logical, natural.
in many ways, I see that we have much better support systems. Just the sheer talent that you run into when you go to a conference like Women in Data Science, and the availability of role models that I think can really lead and excite the next generation to take hold in this area. I think we have really made great strides in that. Although even 10 years ago, I was just mesmerized by this one lady who worked at the, I don't know, don't call me out on it, CIA or somewhere, some kind of, and did really amazing work 20 years earlier. So I think they had been around, they just weren't visible. So I think now we have the luxury of a lot more visibility for role models that you can reach out to, that you connect to. And for the first time in my life at KDD, a 14-year-old girl who came to a conference asked me to take a picture with me. And that was like the first, I was almost embarrassed about that. So I think that is certainly changed. I think the very traditional kind of interactive patterns, how we engage with each other, we have gained more perspective on what it means to be all-inclusive and how to maybe express yourself. I mean, you have seen me argue with Ori and how strong I can come across, and I have started to adjust it a little bit and not debate to death if I want you to convince me that you are right, because I really want you to convince me, and realize that in order to foster this talent, I'm no longer living in a man's world only, and I had to maybe soften my approach in interacting with folks. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question. I think the opportunities have really come a long way. I think some of the struggles of feeling inadequate or having insecurities about what your role is, they are certainly so human that they will always be around, and I'm no stranger to those. And I think those will persist, and we probably need to understand that we have them all, no matter what background we have. So all in all, I feel optimistic about this. Again, I feel the tooling like ChatGPT, like LLMs, allow you to get a companion to help you with the parts of your skill set that maybe need a little bit support, whether this is the technical coding stuff, whether it's me learning more about the intricacies about finance. So I think the playing field has become more level, and I've been very excited to see that. Whether it's really changed my message when I'm talking about this, I don't think so. I think we just continue to try to make more steps forward than backwards every day.
And by the way, for the record, I was witness to that rock star moment of you getting your picture taken, and it was very well deserved because you gave a fantastic talk.
Mhm.
Claudia, when you think about the next kind of couple of years moving forward, what is exciting to you?
I mean, I've learned the hard way in my profession that predicting the future is hard. And so I am really excited about building a house at the lake in the woods on our property that I had the pleasure of hiking with you the other day. I would love for some AI to please deal with all the paperwork and the permits and what have you.
Yes.
I don't hope that this will come to pass by the time I want to, for the first time, sleep out there.
I imagine it would probably, AI would make it worse before it makes it better. So if anybody is interested more in your work or wants to get in touch with you, where can they find you? Not on Instagram or Facebook, that's for sure, but where can they find you?
Best place to reach out is LinkedIn. And please include like a brief message on having listened to us in this conversation. That was great fun. So I have some context and I will reply, and then we can take it either to my personal email or we can jump on a call or whatever is appropriate. So yeah, LinkedIn is the easiest way to get hold of me. If I don't respond, bug me twice. I might need a little bit of a reinforcement.
Right. Well, Claudia, thank you so much for being a guest on Who's Your Data. This is a dream come true. It took 30 episodes to make it happen, but it finally happened, and it was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks again. I think you're asking all the exciting questions, and I'm super happy that we could finally make this work.
And I'll be out at the lake again soon, I hope.
I need somebody to chop some wood.
I'll do it.
See you there.
Well, thanks for joining us today and listening to this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And if you have any questions you'd like addressed, send them to who'syourdatanow@gmail.com. That's who'syourdatanow, all one word, @gmail.com. Thanks, and see you next time on Who's Your Data?